Hey everyone, it's Sevi. Once again, Xiao is joining us for the Lantern Rite Festival, now on his 4th limited banner. As such, some new players might be thinking if this Yaksha is worth pulling for their budding roster, while other older players may be wondering if it's time to finally bring him home. So to help with that, I'll be discussing my thoughts on the current state of Xiao in this video and share some considerations when pulling for him. Of course, if you really like him and have been waiting for so long, then I 100% encourage you to go for him. This video will mainly be for those who are evaluating Xiao in terms of strength, farming efficiency, and primo worth, especially if you're free to play or a low spender. And even if you're dead set on pulling for Xiao, there might still be some pointers you can pick up in this discussion. With that, let's plunge into it. Animo units are mainly known for utilizing the 4-piece Viridescent Venerer set, making them extremely valuable supports in many elemental teams. However, Animo units like Wanderer or Xiao are made to function as the primary DPSs of their teams, pointing towards builds that seem to capitalize on increasing their own damage, which leads to the question of how well they can carry their team. Xiao's kit is that of a hypercarry, particularly geared towards consistent AoE damage over long periods of time, so he excels at clearing waves of multiple enemies. But he isn't as competitive against single targets and enemies with short vulnerability windows. All in all, he will get you through the game's overworld content very well, though depending on Spiral Abyss cycles, he can be a hit or miss. As for how high his damage potential is, there are a few things working against the damage ceilings of such Animo DPSs. For one, unlike elements that have access to big damage buffing reactions like Vaporize or Aggravate, Animo only has Swirl as its reaction. Swirl scales with EM, which EM-focused Animo units take advantage of, but Xiao isn't like that. Swirl isn't meant to be a prominent source of damage for him, as he mainly relies on dealing raw Animo damage. So, without damage buffing reactions to turn to, Xiao depends on buffs from teammates, which already have staple candidates, but Animo-specific buffs and debuffs are also very rare. Many are locked behind 5-star constellations, while Farazan is the most accessible way to shred Animo resistance and give Animo-related buffs, but even she faces her own issues of being constellation dependent. That being said, the damage ceiling of Xiao's hypercarry teams are reliant on Xiao's own damage potential. Such teams revolve around him as the single hyper-invested DPS with lower investment supports that can protect, buff, and battery him but don't deal much damage themselves. This can be a double-edged sword. Such hypercarry teams will have a lower damage ceiling compared to teams that have multiple damage sources, especially those that exploit elemental reactions. On the other hand, Xiao's team can be more efficient on resources, since Xiao is really the only member that demands higher investment, in contrast to teams that want each of their damage sources to be sufficiently invested. That being said, if you want a more flexible 5-star Animo unit who can slot into many other team varieties, then it could be better to wait for the rate-ups of Kazuha or Venti if you don't have them yet. But Xiao's plunged attack playstyle is certainly unique, and I doubt that there'll be another one with similar mechanics anytime soon. This can be fun for some, though I have heard of others who find it too jarring. There's very little skill level required to execute his pogo stick gameplay, which makes him fairly easy to get into. However, there are still some gameplay optimizations you can learn, such as attack combo varieties, optimal plunge height, and effective team rotations, which guides can help with. Although Xiao excels at AoE scenarios, there are some nuances to it. His plunge damage can stagger small enough enemies a lot, which is awesome for disabling them and preventing them from doing damage in the first place. Do note that sometimes this works against you as it pushes enemies away. If you accidentally spread them too much, you might find yourself having to constantly do adjustments to your position or chase enemies around. It's not necessarily a big deal, and there are workarounds, but for me, it's one of the noticeable parts of his combat when it happens. You should be mindful of his energy needs as well, especially since he's a burst-dependent character. Xiao can only generate particles outside of his burst form, so you have to be conscious of funneling his particles before or after he uses his burst to ensure energy generation. But he can also rely on teammates to get his energy back or funnel particles for him, which may need more awareness of how to optimally execute his team rotations. Survivability is another consideration to his gameplay due to his own HP draining mechanics. Although he can avoid some enemy attacks by jumping out of their attack range, he can still take damage during ground time, so he somewhat depends on his teammates to protect him while he's on field, whether through a shielder, a healer, or both. Now, if you do find his gameplay to your liking, the next question is how efficient it is to build him. You'll be relieved to know that his artifact farming can be relatively more convenient compared to those of other DPS characters. One huge pro is that Xiao is not tied to a specific artifact set and is more after good quality substats. You can simply aim for the following 2-piece set combos, or you can even just put on whatever pieces with amazing substats. The 2-piece set combos that he can use are also relatively convenient to acquire, whether via boss farming, strong boxing, or resin efficient domains. Even if the Vermilion Hereafter is supposedly his signature set, it's hard to recommend farming it. While it's at most 10% better than 2-piece combos, you have to weigh in the resin it will take to farm not just a full 4-piece set, but also one with great substats. Furthermore, that gap narrows when you consider attack buffs like Bennett and Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers, making his 2-piece combo still competitive by having better substats. The new 4-piece Desert Pavilion set comes up close to 4-piece Vermilion, so it is viable if you already have a set. Farming its domain can get you pieces for Dendro core triggers, but again, trying to complete a good quality 4-piece set can be costly and not miles ahead of excellent 2-piece combos. Really, sets aren't a big issue as it becomes more of a substat game. Though he does belong to that more traditional category of DPSs, which mainly scale on attack and crit, so min-maxing substats for those can be a bit more challenging. It's even more apparent when you consider that there are other newer characters who scale from stats that come by more easily or have favorable multi-scaling kits. Some characters even only need very simplistic stat builds like a full EM Hyperbloom build on Cookie or Raiden, which require very little to no optimization yet can still output very high damage. But at the end of the day, what's nice is that Xiao's artifacts are at least convenient to passively farm for and strongbox, while you can focus on farming sets for your other DPSs or supports. And since he doesn't really rely on full sets, there's a lot of wiggle room for your artifacts. Then, when accounting for his weapon choices, one consideration is that, unfortunately, he doesn't have a lot of good free-to-play options. Prototype Star Glitter is viable since it at least helps his energy needs, but his best offensive free-to-play 4-star weapons are limited to Blackcliff Pole and Missive Windspear to some extent. While I don't normally recommend using precious Star Glitter currency to get the 4-star shop weapons, this is perhaps one of the best cases for it if you really have no other good 5-star or 4-star options. If you are a Battle Pass spender, even just an R1 deathmatch is a pretty good paid alternative. Then your 4-star gacha options are Lithic Spear to boost his personal damage and Fav Lance if you just want to solve his energy needs or are using him as a VV driver in the team. And he can use pretty much most of the 5-star pole arms if you were lucky enough to get one of them. Now for team considerations. I briefly mentioned earlier how Xiao's hypercarry team comps are typically built. More investment is placed upon him to make sure he does a lot of damage, while other supports can have subpar or low investment builds and still serve their purpose of supporting Xiao as batteries, buffers, and survival units. The recent release of Farazan did create a more accessible way to achieve a higher ceiling for Xiao's damage potential as a hypercarry, since she gives significant animal-related buffs and debuffs that could only previously be found among 5-stars. And although she requires a lot of ER to work smoothly prior to her C6, she and Xiao's common supports don't demand min-maxed builds. So if you can only afford to invest in Xiao in the meantime, his teams as a whole are at least not as expensive to build. But even if I've been discussing most of Xiao's aspects as a hypercarry, it may come as a surprise that Xiao doesn't always have to be the only main damage dealer on his teams. For instance, there's the option to run him with single-target DPSs like Yelan or Xingqiu in order to help with Xiao's not as high single-target damage capabilities. There are also dual-carry comps like Xiao and Raiden, or Xiaoden, which utilizes Raiden as a second on-field unit while also batterying Xiao. Another more unusual niche case is if you actually do run Xiao as a 4-piece Viridescent Venerer user. I know, it sounds like sacrilege. We expect Xiao to be one of the animal units that goes against the VV trend. But still, you might be surprised that it is a potential build and there are good teams out there for a VV Xiao. After all, he's still going to use attack, crit, and animo damage main stats, but the benefit is that he can simultaneously shred enemy resistance to make your off-field DPSs deal more damage. So if you have other off-field DPS teammates like Xiangling, Rosaria, Yelan, Xingqiu, etc., using Xiao as your on-field unit and driver, equipped with 4-piece VV to shred enemy resistance, can actually result in higher team damage. This higher damage ceiling will, in turn, need more invested and well-built teammates, but that's the trade-off. That being said, Xiao doesn't necessarily perform the role of VV Shredder much better than most other animo units, so you'll end up with his hypercarry comps more often. But at least the alternative is there if you want to expand his teams and roles. If you're geared on being a huge Xiao simp, you might also be thinking about investing into his constellations. With the frequency that Xiao is rerunning, this might entice some players to make it a long-term goal to collect his constellations. The way I see it, Xiao sadly has one of the worst constellation spreads of 5-star characters. On one hand, you can look at the bright side because it means that he should feel very complete at C0, but you may have noticed the trend of 5-star characters having significant enough upgrades on their second constellations. While it's not exactly cheap to attain that if you're free to play or a low spender, it's a relatively achievable goal if you roll for the same character on their reruns or if you've saved up a lot of primos for them. However, Xiao doesn't have good primo value with his cons. C1 is for mobility and added particle generation and damage, though Xiao certainly does not need it. After all, the energy problems C1 helps with can be addressed by building more ER or adding better battery supports or Favonius users on his teams. Then from there, C2 to C5 are so underwhelming that the only real reason and reward to want to go for his constellations is to get C6, which is where he becomes a monster. But obviously, that's whale territory already. Basically, Xiao is not a character that is as feasible to roll constellations for, which might be disappointing if you were looking forward to vertically investing in him. But again, take it as a sign that at least you can be content with his value at C0. Finally, I'd be remiss not to consider the 5 stars that he's running with in the upcoming patch. If you're much more interested in exploring Dendro teams, then Alhaitham, who is running alongside him, might be the more worth it pull, in contrast to Xiao, who practically has no relevance to the Dendro meta. From my early assessment, he seems to have a bit more versatility, as he can act as a spread DPS, or as a driver for many other Dendro teams, especially Bloom-related ones. Xiao also has stiff competition against the 2 banners coming after him, Hu Tao and Yelan. Hu Tao is a pyro DPS that can at least take advantage of elemental reactions and has an established reputation of being a monster in single target battles. And Yelan is an incredible off-field Hydro DPS that enables a lot of Hydro-based elemental reactions in teams, and is in general an amazing pick if your Hydro roster needs more variety. It depends on what you want and how you want your character roster to evolve. If you're looking for other team types or more versatile alternatives, look into those characters and consider first if you would get more personal value out of their banners. But ultimately, if you're set on Xiao, then hopefully my pointers helped prepare you better. If you're a Xiao haver or if you're not that interested in him, let me know your thoughts in the comments either way. And that's it for this video. If you enjoyed, leave a like and check out my playlist of guides for more informative content. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all soon. Take care!